came home sick early from work and caught my parents helping themselves to my house, so I called the cops and then. I never expected my own family to make me feel like a trespasser in my own life. But that's exactly what started happening the day my brother got married, and everything around me shifted like furniture after a storm. My name's Savannah, I'm 37, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've spent the last 15 years climbing through every branch of the corporate tree until I made it to where I am now, director of operations at a wellness company that sells clean sports nutrition across the Southwest. People ask me all the time why I'm not married, like there's some secret flaw hiding under my clothes. The truth is far less dramatic. I like my independence, I love my work, and I don't want to build a life just for the sake of saying I did. I've dated, sure. I've even had 1 or 2 relationships that might have gone further. But when I looked at what I had, the career I'd built, the peace in my home, the ability to do what I wanted with my time, I never felt like I was missing anything. 2 years ago, I finally bought a place of my own. It took me nearly a full year of looking, weighing neighborhoods, dealing with pushy agents, and chasing down financing, but I finally landed a house that felt like it belonged to me the moment I stepped through the door. It's got 3 bedrooms, a sunlit kitchen, a tiny patch of yard that somehow still manages to bloom each spring, and it sits in a quiet part of town close enough to the company that I can walk when the weather's right. It's not a mansion or anything, but it's mine. Every tile and beam was paid for by me, and I worked my ass off to make that possible. So when my younger brother Riley announced he was marrying Jasmine, his girlfriend of 3 years, I felt genuinely happy for them. Riley's always been a little more dependent than I am, but he's a good guy with a big heart. Jasmine seemed nice enough the few times I saw her at family dinners. She was polite, always asked me about work, laughed at my dad's bad jokes, and made sure Riley stayed on time for everything. It was easy to like her at first. That changed later. They got married in 2022, in a modest ceremony up in Sedona. It was small, charming, and completely stress-free, which is rare, considering how our family normally gets when there's a wedding involved. I gave them a check for $18,000 as a wedding gift. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment gesture. I saved for it, knowing it could help them start out without financial pressure. And even though no one really acknowledged how big of a gift that was, I didn't expect them to. I did it for Riley, not for applause. After the honeymoon, they moved into a 1-bedroom apartment that technically belongs to our parents. It's old but decent, right near the edge of Scottsdale, and they weren't charged rent. Not even $1. I covered their utilities, gas, water, electricity, because my mother asked me to, and I didn't think twice about saying yes. Helping family felt like the right thing to do. I didn't realize, at the time, how quickly that generosity would be twisted into an obligation. For the first few months, everything felt normal. We still did our Sunday dinners at my parents' place, still sat around the same chipped wooden table we'd eaten at since middle school. Jasmine would ask about my work, tell me about their wedding photos, mention baby names they liked. At some point, though, I started noticing little changes in her tone. Subtle things, like how she would say, "It must be nice to have room to breathe," while sipping wine at the dinner table. Or how she once looked around the crowded living room of my parents' house and said, "Some people really luck out when it comes to square footage." At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe she wasn't talking about me at all. But those little comments kept coming, and they always came after a sip of wine or a shared glance with Riley. Then my mother started echoing them. Casual remarks about how empty my house must feel, about how lonely it must be without anyone else living there. My father didn't say much at first, but he started joining in with his usual half-smile, adding things like, "You ever think about renting out a room?" Sweetheart. It didn't stop there. Jasmine made a point, every single dinner, to talk about how tight things were in the apartment. She'd lean forward and describe how the baby, oh yes, I forgot to mention, she started hinting at children within weeks of the wedding, would need more space to crawl, and that there just wasn't enough room for a growing family. And every time she said that, she'd glance over at me with this strange, unreadable look. Riley, for his part, didn't push it too hard at first. He would just nod along, throw in a, "Yeah, we're trying to figure something out," and change the subject. But gradually, even he started adding his own shade. He said things like, "I know it's not ideal, but babies can't really sleep in closets, right?" while nudging Jasmine and laughing. I wanted to laugh too, but it didn't feel like a joke. The worst part wasn't even their comments, it was my parents' reactions. They nodded, they smiled, they agreed. No one told Jasmine to cool it. No one said anything about how she and Riley were already getting more support than most newlyweds ever see. Instead, my mother would say things like, You know, Savannah, family makes sacrifices for each other. Or worse, that house has too many empty rooms for one person to be rattling around in. I stopped responding to those kinds of comments altogether. I wasn't going to start a scene during dinner, and I didn't want to turn my brother's new marriage into a battleground. But I could feel something shifting underneath the surface, something slow and ugly. It was like everyone had decided that my success was a resource for them to manage, not something I had earned. 3 months after the wedding, the subtle tension that had been quietly building finally cracked into something far more deliberate. We were sitting around my parents' dining table, the usual Sunday meal laid out like it always was: baked chicken, green beans, garlic rolls, and a pitcher of sweet tea sweating on the counter. But there was an energy in the room that didn't feel right, and I felt it the second I walked in. My mother was fluttering between the kitchen and the table, humming louder than normal, and my father couldn't stop grinning like he'd just won a prize he didn't deserve. Riley looked nervous but proud, and Jasmine looked like someone who'd rehearsed a speech and couldn't wait to deliver it. She kept glancing at my parents, then at her plate, then at me. We hadn't even touched our food when Riley cleared his throat, reached for Jasmine's hand, and said they had some news. I knew what was coming before the words left his mouth. Jasmine beamed like a lottery winner and said, "We're having a baby." My parents broke into tears on cue. My mother threw her arms around Jasmine, nearly knocking over her glass, while my father slapped Riley on the back and told him he was finally a man. I smiled and congratulated them, and I meant it. I really did. Riley was going to be a father, and even if I didn't like the way things had been shifting lately, that was a big deal. But just as quickly as the celebration started, it turned into something else. The congratulations barely had time to settle before my mother looked across the table and said, "Well, at least one of my children is giving me grandchildren." I didn't respond. There was nothing I could have said in that moment that wouldn't have turned dinner into a war zone. Jasmine didn't even wait for dessert. She launched straight into it with that same calm, calculated smile she always wore when she was about to say something she knew would land hard. "Savannah," she said, looking right at me for once, "I've been talking to Riley and your parents about our living situation." I didn't move, didn't blink, just waited for the punchline. "We all agree that the way housing is divided in this family isn't really balanced." The room went quiet except for the sound of my fork hitting my plate. I asked her what exactly that meant, even though I already knew. She didn't hesitate. "You live in that beautiful house all by yourself," she said, like that was some kind of crime. "And we're about to raise a baby in a one-bedroom apartment that doesn't even have a dining area." I glanced at my parents, hoping, just hoping, that they'd jump in and shut it down. But they didn't. In fact, my mother leaned forward, rested her elbows on the table, and said, "Honey, maybe it's time you think about what really matters in life." Then my father added, as casually as if he were reading off a shopping list, "We think it would make sense for you to move into Riley's apartment and let them raise the baby in your house. They need the space more than you." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because I was stunned silent and needed to do something other than scream. "You can't be serious," I said, still trying to keep my voice level. "You're suggesting I hand over the house I spent 15 years earning to someone else?" They nodded. They all nodded. My own parents, the people I had helped countless times over the years, were sitting there telling me I didn't deserve my home. My father, looking smug, said, "We're not saying give it away. You'd get the apartment. That's a fair trade, don't you think?" I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. But I looked at each one of them and said, very clearly, "Absolutely not. That house is mine. I bought it. I pay for it. And I'm not giving it up for anyone." My mother clucked her tongue like I was a child misbehaving in public. "Don't be selfish, Savannah. This is your brother. This is your family." That's when Riley decided to join in, like he'd been holding back until the moment he could play the victim. "You gave us money for the wedding," he said, "and you help with our bills. Why is this different?" I turned to him and said, "Because giving is a choice. What you're doing now isn't asking. It's demanding." Jasmine folded her napkin carefully, set it on her plate, and said, "It's not demanding to expect help from someone who has more than they need." I didn't say another word. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door without even finishing dinner. On the drive home, I played the conversation over and over again in my head, trying to find the part where I had missed something, where I had misheard. But there was nothing to misinterpret. My family had decided that because I wasn't married, because I didn't have a child on the way, my success was fair game. That night, the call started. First from my mother, then Riley, then Jasmine. Voicemails full of guilt and disappointment, and thinly veiled threats about how I was letting down the people who loved me most. I didn't respond. I didn't know them an explanation for defending my own life. The next morning, I got a text from my dad that said, "You can't take it with you when you're gone, Savannah. Houses are for families." That one actually made me laugh. I'd never heard him say anything even remotely philosophical in my entire life. Clearly, Jasmine had gotten to him too. Then came the guilt parade. Jasmine started sending me pictures of the apartment, pointing out how small it was. My mother sent Bible verses about sacrifice and love. Riley texted me ultrasound photos with captions like, "Do you really want your niece growing up in a closet?" They made it seem like my refusal to hand over my house was the root of all their problems. But here's the thing that none of them seemed to understand. I didn't know them a damn thing. I'd worked too hard, lost too much sleep, skipped too many vacations, and poured too much of myself into building the life I had. And now they wanted to act like it was just a matter of rearranging things? Like all I had to do was step aside and let Riley and Jasmine move in because their choices had suddenly become more valid than mine? I started locking my doors even when I was home. Something about the way they were talking made me feel uneasy, like this wasn't just a bad idea they were floating. It was a plan, and I was the only thing standing in the way. I stopped going to Sunday dinners after that. I needed distance. I needed space. And I knew that if I walked into that house again, I wouldn't be able to hold my tongue. I'd say something I couldn't take back. Or worse, I'd break down in front of them. And I refused to let them see me crumble. The house felt quieter than usual after all that. But it didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Every time I looked at the kitchen I remodeled myself, or sat in the reading nook I'd built during a snowstorm last winter, I reminded myself, I didn't inherit this house, I earned it. No matter what anyone else believed, that wasn't up for debate. It had been a week since I'd cut off contact, and part of me was hoping they'd take the hint and leave it alone. But my family's persistence was never subtle, especially when they felt entitled to something. The text kept trickling in like dripping water from a cracked pipe, small, annoying, and impossible to ignore forever. I stopped opening them. There were messages about how the baby would grow up resenting me, how family meant sacrifice, how I would regret choosing isolation over love. I ignored them all. I kept my head down at work. I stayed off social media, and I only answered calls from people whose names didn't make my stomach twist. My friend Leah, who's known my family's dynamics better than most, kept checking in. "You good?" She'd ask every few days. And every time, I'd say yes, even when I wasn't entirely sure. Then came Friday. I remember it clearly because I hadn't been feeling well that morning. My head was heavy, my throat scratchy, and by noon I had a full-blown fever. I told my boss I needed to head out early, and thankfully she waved me off without asking questions. I just wanted to get home, make some tea, and sleep off whatever bug had caught me. I pulled into my driveway around 2:30 and immediately noticed something that didn't belong. A giant white moving truck was parked along the curb, engine off but hazard lights blinking. I could see two men in blue polo shirts unloading boxes onto a dolly. My stomach dropped. My parents' old tin SUV was in the driveway, right behind the truck. For a second, I thought maybe I was hallucinating. I wasn't. I parked on the street, got out slowly, and walked up the steps to my own front door. It wasn't even locked. That fact alone made my pulse spike. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of cardboard and dust, like a storage unit had exploded in my living room. My mother was wrapping up my dishes in newspaper. My father had his back to me, pulling books from my shelf and stuffing them into a box labeled guest room. "What the hell is going on here?" I said, louder than I meant to. They froze like kids caught sneaking cookies, except there was no shame on their faces, just irritation that I'd come home early. "Oh, Savannah," my mother said, forcing a strained smile. "We thought you'd be at work until 5. I asked you a question," I said again, this time slower. "What are you doing in my house?" My father didn't even look up. He muttered something about helping me move, like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. My mother stepped closer, still holding a bundle of my dinner plates like it was nothing. "We talked about this," she said, as if it was just another family chore. "Riley and Jasmine need this house now. You're moving into the apartment. We hired movers to help speed things up." I couldn't even respond right away. I just stood there, feeling my pulse in my ears and the heat rising under my skin. "You hired movers to pack up my house without telling me?" I asked. My father finally turned around, holding a box of my framed photos like it belonged to him. "We all decided this was for the best," he said, as if my voice had never been part of that decision. "I already told you I wasn't moving," I said, louder this time, struggling to keep my breath even. "I told you that a dozen times." "Well, you weren't being reasonable," my mother said, as if that justified every violation happening around me. I looked around the room, at the boxes stacked along the walls, at the sofa cushions removed and set aside like they were inventory. And then I walked upstairs, into my bedroom, shut the door, and called the police. The dispatcher picked up after 2 rings. I gave my name, my address, and said very clearly, there are people inside my home who entered without permission. They're packing my belongings and refusing to leave. Are you in immediate danger? The dispatcher asked. No, I said, but they're removing property that doesn't belong to them, and I want them gone. She promised to send someone right away. I stayed upstairs, pacing back and forth while gripping my phone so hard my fingers started to ache. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. But I could feel something inside me locking into place, something hard and final. The police showed up less than 10 minutes later, 2 officers, both calm and professional. I came downstairs with them and explained the situation while my parents stood frozen near the boxes like mannequins in a showroom. Sir, did your daughter give you permission to be inside her home? One officer asked my dad. No, but she's our daughter, he replied, as if blood ties erased the need for consent. The other officer turned to me. Ma'am, do you want them removed from the property? He asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. And I'd like to press charges for unlawful entry. That's when my mother started shouting. You can't do this, Savannah. We're your parents. She tried to grab my arm, but the officer stepped between us. My father, always one to keep control, lost his cool. This is ridiculous, he shouted, pushing a box aside. You're siding with a selfish woman who doesn't understand family. And just like that, he swung his arm toward one of the officers. It wasn't much of a hit, more like a flailing gesture, but it was enough. They cuffed him right there in the middle of my living room. My mother kept shrieking, her voice rising into something animal. The movers stood awkwardly in the doorway, one of them asking if they should still take the boxes or put them back. Put everything back exactly where you found it, I said. And send the bill to whoever hired you. They nodded, clearly eager to get the hell out of there. Once my parents were escorted outside, I stood alone in the silence, my house half unpacked like a crime scene frozen mid-theft. I sat on the kitchen stool, ran my hand across the smooth granite counter, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle onto my shoulders. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was my mother, calling from the police station. Her voice was thick with disbelief, like she still couldn't wrap her mind around the idea that consequences applied to her. Savannah, you need to fix this, she said. We were just trying to help you move. You can't be serious about pressing charges. We're your family. I let the silence stretch. Then I said, you broke into my home. You tried to take everything I built. I'm not fixing anything. You're destroying this family, she said, her voice rising. If you go through with this, don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I replied. And I'm not interested in pretending any of this was okay. Then I hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time afterward, half expecting her to call back, half hoping she wouldn't. She didn't. The next morning, I drove to the police station and signed the paperwork confirming my decision. I refused to drop the charges. They could deal with the system they always assumed was beneath them. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I wasn't going to make peace with people who thought my independence was theirs to distribute. They taught me everything I needed to know with their actions. And I was finally done pretending I didn't see it. They made bail that same evening, which didn't surprise me. My parents had savings, no record, and too much pride to sit behind a holding cell longer than absolutely necessary. What had surprised me, though, was the quiet. For 2 full days, my phone didn't ring. No voicemails, no texts, not even a random emoji from Riley or Jasmine. It felt like someone had unplugged the whole system, and honestly, I was grateful for the silence. Then on the 3rd morning, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I checked, it was my grandmother. Her voice was calm but tired, the kind of tired that settles deep in your bones. Savannah, she said, your parents are devastated. They didn't expect you to follow through. They didn't expect you to take it that far. I stared at the wall while her message kept going. She tried to thread the needle, acknowledge that they were wrong, but also nudged me back into the family's orbit. She ended with something that stuck with me. They're still your parents, honey. Even when they screw up, they're still the ones who raised you. I didn't return her call right away. I needed time to think, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. Because what do you do when the people who raised you become the people who betrayed you? What do you do when the word family starts to feel like a trap instead of a comfort? That weekend, I got a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real, handwritten letter in my mother's perfectly practiced cursive, folded neatly in an envelope with my name written like I was being summoned to a wedding. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one they'd tried to box up, and read it in full. It started with what I think she thought was grace. Savannah, it read, after long discussion with your father and Riley, we've made a final decision. You are no longer part of this family. We are disowning you, effective immediately. You have chosen selfishness over loyalty, property over people, and your own pride over the needs of your blood. We will not be contacting you again, and we expect the same in return. It was signed, former mother. I stared at the words, waiting to feel the gut punch they'd probably hoped for. I waited to feel the grief, the regret, the sorrow. Instead, what I felt was lighter. I folded the letter in half, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer next to my old tax documents. It didn't deserve to be burned. It didn't deserve to be held. It was just paperwork now useless, out of date, irrelevant. That next week was the quietest my life had been in years. I went to work, came home to a house that was still mine, and felt something like peace beginning to form. No more Sunday dinners. No more pressure to smile through veiled insults. No more guilt about living the life I had built. The absence of their voices felt like space clearing out around me. I still spoke with my grandmother now and then. She never took sides outright, but she made her stance clear in little ways, checking in, asking about my week, casually mentioning she missed my cooking. One day, she told me that Riley and Jasmine were still in the studio apartment, still blaming me for their cramped life. Then she said something that made me stop stirring my coffee. They're thinking about selling both the studio and their house, using the money to buy two smaller places. One for them, one for your parents. I paused. So, they could have done that all along? I asked. I think they just didn't want to spend their own money, she said quietly. They thought it would be easier to take what you had instead. I didn't say anything right away. I just let her words hang in the air like dust motes in the morning light. She was right. They didn't want a solution. They wanted a shortcut. And I was supposed to be the road they walked over to get there. A few days later, Leah and I grabbed drinks after work, and I told her everything. I wasn't expecting much of a reaction, but she slammed her glass down so hard it startled the table next to us. You realize they were planning this for months, right? She said. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to pack your house. That was a coordinated move. It hit me then just how deep the manipulation had gone. The guilt tripping, the subtle comments, the staged Sunday dinners. Every bit of it had been part of a slow campaign to wear me down. They didn't just want my house. They wanted to convince me I didn't deserve it. I found out later that Jasmine had even spoken with a real estate agent, asked about how to transfer ownership within family without complications. My own brother apparently offered to take care of the paperwork to spare me the effort. The plan had been in motion before I even knew I was a target. But the best part, the part that still makes me laugh when I'm washing dishes or folding laundry, is that they truly believed I wouldn't fight back, that I would cry or cave or hand over the keys out of guilt. They thought the house meant more to them because they had a baby on the way, because they'd followed the traditional route and I hadn't. What they didn't understand is that I hadn't built my life to impress them. I'd built it to survive. 6 months later, I heard through a friend that they'd gone through with it. They sold the apartment and the house. Jasmine posted a photo of their new 2-bedroom condo with a caption about fresh starts and blessings in disguise. My parents moved into a small retirement complex 2 towns over. No one reached out, not even once. Meanwhile, I was still here, still working, still thriving. I got promoted. I painted my living room. I finally bought the dining chairs I'd been eyeing for years but kept postponing because they felt too luxurious. Every inch of this house began to feel even more mine. Sometimes I miss the idea of family dinners, the warm smell of roast chicken, the sound of forks clinking, the occasional joke that made everyone laugh at once. But I don't miss the real thing. I don't miss the weight of constant criticism disguised as concern. I don't miss feeling like my life had to be justified just because it didn't fit into their expectations. I still speak to my grandmother. She asks how I'm doing. I tell her I'm good. And for the first time in a long time, I mean it. About a year after everything blew apart, I finally stopped expecting new drama to show up at my doorstep. I had let go of the tension that used to sit on my shoulders like wet cement, and for the first time in a long time, I started to feel fully comfortable in my own skin. The air in my house felt still, not silent in an empty way, but peaceful, like a lake before sunrise. I was working more efficiently, sleeping better, even cooking again without feeling like someone might barge through the door and ask for something I wasn't willing to give. And then, just as I let myself exhale, something strange happened. I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. Just a photo, no caption, no explanation. It was a picture of a newborn baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes closed, tiny fist balled at her cheeks. I didn't need anyone to tell me who it was. Jasmine had given birth. Less than a minute later, another text came through. She should know her aunt. Don't let your pride rob her of family. I didn't respond. I deleted the number. But something in my chest clenched, not out of guilt, but because I could already feel the gears turning behind the scenes again. They were trying a new angle, tugging at a different part of the heart, the part that still remembered birthdays and bedtime stories and scraped knees. I reminded myself that sentiment was a powerful drug, and they knew exactly how to weaponize it. A week passed. I thought maybe they'd let it drop. Then one Thursday morning, just as I was leaving the house for work, I found a manila envelope wedged between my storm door and the frame. It was thick, official-looking, with my name typed across the front. Inside were legal papers, pages and pages of them. My hands started shaking before I was even halfway through. Riley and Jasmine had filed a civil suit, an actual lawsuit, claiming partial ownership of my house based on a verbal agreement that they said had been made with my parents' knowledge. They were arguing that because I had contributed financially to the family over the years and had promised the home would one day go to them, they were entitled to at least 50% of it. It was absurd. It was insane. And yet, they had signatures, statements, timelines. The part that nearly made me scream came near the bottom. My father had signed a notarized affidavit claiming he had discussed long-term inheritance plans with me and that I had agreed the house would be transferred to Riley when he became a father. It was dated 2 months before the wedding. I stood in my kitchen holding those pages, and for the first time in a very long time, I actually felt afraid. Not afraid of losing my house. I knew I had enough documentation and a strong enough case to fight that, but afraid of what else they were capable of. If they were willing to lie under oath. To forge a paper trail, what came next? I hired a lawyer that afternoon. She was sharp, experienced, and calm in the way that made you believe she'd seen much worse and come out victorious. When I told her everything, she didn't flinch. They're pushing for a settlement, she said. But if we dig, there's probably something they're not telling us. No one goes this far unless they're hiding something. And she was right. 3 weeks into preparing my response, she called me on a Friday morning sounding unusually alert. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. "We found something." Turns out, the notarized affidavit my father submitted, the one he swore was signed in person with a licensed official, wasn't just misleading. It was fake. The notary stamp had been copied from a template found online, and the notary's license number belonged to someone who hadn't worked in the state for over 5 years. Forged document. Fraudulent claim. Felony-level offense. I sat there in silence as she explained it, my fingers numb around the phone. "We're submitting it to the court," she added. "Expect things to move quickly from here." And they did. My father was arrested again, this time not in the middle of my living room, but in a courtroom hallway after being confronted with the evidence. My lawyer said his expression didn't even change, like he'd known it was coming the entire time. Riley and Jasmine dropped the suit the next day, citing emotional stress and misunderstandings. But the strangest part came a week later, when I got a call from my grandmother. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, her voice heavy. "That tip about the forgery? The one your lawyer said came in anonymously? That was me." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. She kept talking, filling the silence. "I saw what they were doing, and I couldn't stomach it. I told your father I'd stay out of it, but when I saw that fake document, I couldn't. You didn't deserve any of this." My throat tightened, not from sadness, not even from relief, but from the strange realization that someone in the family had finally chosen to do the right thing, even if it came far too late. We met for coffee the next weekend. She brought a tin of homemade cookies and sat across from me like we were two strangers meeting for the first time. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," she said after a long pause. "I always thought you'd fold under pressure, but you didn't. You held the line." I nodded slowly. "I just didn't want to lose everything I built," I said. "You didn't," she replied. "They lost everything trying to take what was never theirs." A few months passed. I painted my hallway, bought new shelves for the guest room, started taking long morning walks with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Jasmine stopped posting on social media. Riley disappeared entirely from the internet. The silence that followed was deafening, but this time, it was the kind of quiet that meant closure. The final twist came 6 months later when I got a notification from the county property office. A title transfer had been processed for a small condo in a nearby suburb, one listed under Riley and Jasmine's names. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it was theirs. Paid for with money they'd scraped together after selling the last pieces of what my parents had left them. I don't know if they're happy now. I don't know if they tell themselves a different story at night, one where I was the villain and they were only asking for what was fair. But I do know this. They can no longer take anything from me. Not my peace, not my home, and not the narrative of who I am. I still live in the same house. Still cook dinner in the same kitchen. Still walk barefoot across the same floors I once fought to keep. And when I sit in my quiet living room, cup of tea in hand, I no longer feel like I'm bracing for the next betrayal. I feel like I finally won.